Bryan Kohberger sat motionless. No shake of emotion. No apology. Just a man surrounded by grief, as one by one, the families of the victims stood and unleashed the pain he left behind. When Kaylee Goncalves' sister, Olivia, stepped to the microphone, the courtroom shifted. You want the truth? Here's the one you'll hate the most. If you hadn't attacked them in their sleep, in the middle of the night like a pedophile, Kaylee would have kicked your fucking ass. Her aim was clear, to dismantle his arrogance. She'd researched him for weeks. I stalked the stalker. I found everything that I could online. It fueled me to know that I got you pegged. I had one shot at it, and I was going to make the most of it. That was July 23, 2025, a date etched in emotional fury, courtroom grief, and uncomfortable silence. For the facts, not the spin, subscribe now. This story isn't over. Nearly 3 years after the brutal stabbing deaths of 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, Bryan Kohberger stood in front of the court. He wore a prison jumpsuit. His hands were shackled. But it was his face that disturbed people most, still, blank, unreadable. In the courthouse that day, Kohberger wore emotional absence like armor. When given the final opportunity to speak before sentencing, he nodded and answered. I respectfully decline. No confession. No remorse. No explanation. Kohberger received 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, 1 for each murder, and an additional 10-year burglary sentence, along with $270,000 in fines paid to the families. He waived his right to appeal and avoided the death penalty via a plea agreement. And for the families, that deal brought mixed emotions. They wouldn't have to sit through a graphic trial and justice was delivered. But closure? That still feels far away. Olivia Goncalves stepped up to the microphone first and her words sliced through the silence. You're a delusional, pathetic, hypochondriac loser. You aren't special or deep. You want the truth? Here's the one you'll hate the most. She admitted she feared arrest over the intensity of her statement, but argued it was worth it. Kaylee's parents, Steve and Christy Goncalves, spoke next. From the gallery, Steve told Kohberger. From this moment, we'll forget you. You tried to plant fear. You failed. You united everyone in their disgust for you. Christy added. You are nothing but the property of the state of Idaho. I hope your life is filled with misery. Ethan Chapin's mother described how holidays had become haunted. How the dinner table still had 4 chairs, but now always one sat empty. Madison's father spoke through clenched teeth about a daughter who would never graduate, never fall in love, never return home. Dylan Mortensen, one of the survivors, broke down, describing panic attacks and ongoing nightmares. Calling Kohberger soulless, she stared into his eyes, unanswered. Some statements were screamed. Others whispered through tears, but their combined impact pierced the courtroom like knives. When it came for sentencing, Judge Stephen Hippler looked Kohberger squarely in the eye. His words were sharp. You are a faceless coward. Truth be told, I'm unable to come up with anything redeeming about Mr. Kohberger. His actions have made him the worst of the worst. You chose silence. You chose control. And today, we remove that from you. The plea deal, while controversial, was strategic. Prosecutors believed it would spare the families the agony of reliving the murder details in court. The defense knew the evidence was damning: DNA on a knife sheath, cell tower pings, and surveillance footage. But it also meant Kohberger never had to explain himself. Never get that raw unraveling that sometimes happens in the pressure cooker of cross-examination. Combined with the lack of confession, it amplified public frustration. Outside the courtroom, people gathered. Some cried. Some screamed. And some just stared at the building, as if hoping it would speak. Kohberger left the court behind bars, escorted out by deputies. As the doors closed and the headlines ran their course, one fact remained: this sentencing answered the what. Now, we are left to wonder, why? Now we uncover what happened after sentencing, when the gag order that silenced everyone for over a year was finally lifted. The release of that order wasn't just procedural, it opened the gates to a wave of sealed documents, testimonies, and police reports that had never been seen by the public before. And what we found inside those documents was devastating. One report in particular stands out. It describes in vivid detail how 20-year-old Xana Kernodle, one of the 4 murdered victims, fought back. She didn't die in her sleep. She woke up. She resisted. And based on her injuries, police believe she may have fought for nearly a minute, creating noise and movement that disrupted Kohberger's timeline. She had multiple deep defensive wounds on her hands and fingers. There were bruises on her forearms, suggesting she tried to block and grab the blade. There was blood spatter on the walls that didn't match any known attack pattern. Investigators believe Xana may have thrown off Kohberger's mental script, making his plan far messier than he intended. And here's what that means: her resistance may have saved another life. Because according to the surviving roommate, who heard crying and movement on the second floor, Xana's desperate struggle might have alerted the killer that someone was awake, and that was enough to make him flee. Kohberger left behind the murder weapon's sheath, which carried his DNA. He left 2 surviving witnesses. And he left behind the exact thing he tried so hard to erase: a trail of resistance. Now, remember, this was never shared at the time of his arrest. It only surfaced once the gag order was lifted. And the reason it hits so hard now is because it shatters the illusion that this was a clean, cold, emotionless crime. It wasn't. It was violent. Chaotic. Interrupted. And that's not all the documents revealed. Among the files was a summary of Kohberger's psychological evaluations. Nothing official has been released publicly, but former inmates and officers who interacted with him have described his behavior inside jail as disturbing. He would take hour-long showers, pacing back and forth, often whispering to himself. He reportedly washed his hands dozens of times per day. And more than once, he was seen smiling at nothing. Some speculate this is a sign of extreme OCD. Others believe it was a coping mechanism, or perhaps, a glimpse of something darker. But what's chilling is that in every interaction, Kohberger remained calm. Polite. Articulate. He never raised his voice. Never showed fear. He stayed invisible. And that invisibility extended to the weeks leading up to the murders. Because just a month before the killings, newly released body cam footage shows Kohberger being pulled over by police in Indiana while driving with his father. In the footage, which lasts about 10 minutes, Kohberger is calm, friendly, and cooperative. The officer lets him go with a warning. To the casual observer, he's just another guy on a road trip. But watching that footage now, knowing what he would do just weeks later, gives it a dark weight. You see him talking. Smiling. Explaining his route. And it's that normalcy that makes him terrifying. Because Kohberger didn't look like a killer. He looked like someone you'd pass on the street and never think twice about. And that's where the horror lives. Not in the blood. Not in the crime scene. But in the banality of the man who did it. And yet, despite everything, we still don't have a motive. Kohberger never gave one. He declined to testify. He declined to speak. He declined to explain. So what are we left with? Speculation. Some believe he chose his victims based on proximity and perceived vulnerability. Others believe he wanted to commit the perfect crime as a psychological experiment. One theory suggests he had been stalking the home for weeks, mapping out movements, waiting for a moment when the house was most exposed. But no theory has ever been confirmed. And maybe that's the point. Because as Judge Stephen Hippler said during sentencing, some people believe there is value in understanding why. But I believe this man doesn't deserve that platform. He doesn't get to be studied. He doesn't get to be humanized. He doesn't get to explain. He just gets to disappear. But the truth is, the story doesn't disappear. Not for the families. Not for the roommates. Not for the investigators still combing through every detail. Because the story of what happened inside that house isn't just a case file. It's 4 lives. 4 families. 4 futures erased. And 1 name that continues to haunt headlines without ever speaking a single word. If this part of the story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think happened that night? And why do you believe he stayed silent? For more cases like this, ones that dig beneath the headlines, subscribe to the channel now. We're just getting started. After the cameras stopped rolling. After the courtroom emptied. After the headlines faded, the story kept breathing. Because justice on paper doesn't mean peace in real life. And for the families left behind, peace still feels like a distant hope. Following sentencing, prosecutors filed a motion requesting that Bryan Kohberger be banned from communicating with the victims' families for the next 99 years. That includes letters, messages, social media interactions, or indirect attempts to contact them through third parties. It sounds extreme, but it was triggered by real concern. Because according to sources close to the case, at least 1 family received anonymous messages, short, chilling texts, after Kohberger's name became public. One message allegedly read, "He's innocent. And they'll pay." Law enforcement couldn't tie the number to anyone specific. But the psychological impact on the families? Devastating. As a result, the court is seeking to make complete silence a legal condition of Kohberger's incarceration. But that doesn't mean the public is staying quiet. Let's talk about the forensic fallout, because while the conviction is done, the evidence still raises questions. The murder weapon was never found. Despite exhaustive searches of rivers, forests, dumpsters, even cadaver dogs, police could not locate the knife. And while Kohberger's DNA was found on the knife sheath left behind, critics argue that doesn't explain the full crime scene. Here's why: there were no fingerprints. No digital traces inside the house. No camera footage of Kohberger entering or leaving the scene. For some forensic analysts, that's suspicious. Because even the most careful killer usually leaves more than 1 breadcrumb. So people ask, was someone helping him? Did he clean the scene beforehand? Or was this the result of painstaking premeditation? Some believe Kohberger may have practiced this before. Not murder necessarily, but how to clean, how to move in darkness, how to erase a footprint before it's made. It's speculation, but speculation that keeps people up at night. And then there's the legal blowback. Kohberger's defense team has already signaled plans to challenge parts of the investigation retroactively. Their argument? That some evidence may have been obtained without proper warrants early in the case. That could trigger post-conviction appeals, not to overturn the sentence, but to reduce the weight of precedent in future criminal trials involving digital surveillance. In other words, even behind bars, Kohberger's case could still reshape criminal law. And that's where public opinion fractures. Because the question becomes, should someone who's already admitted guilt still have the right to influence future cases? Should his name still hold power in courtrooms he'll never enter again? Or should we do what the judge suggested, erase him? Those aren't just legal questions. They're moral ones. And they sit beside a deeper, quieter dilemma. Should we want to understand monsters? Because understanding doesn't mean excusing. But it can feel like it. Families like the Goncalves and Chapins have said they don't want his motive. They don't want to hear him speak. They just want him gone. But other viewers, millions around the world, still ask, what was he thinking that night? Did he feel anything when Xana fought back? Did he plan to kill all 4, or did something go wrong? These are the kinds of questions that keep this case alive. They're uncomfortable, controversial, but real. In the wake of sentencing, several families have begun pushing for reforms. Better protections for off-campus student housing. Mental health screening in criminology departments. Early intervention for obsessive digital behavior linked to violence. Kaylee Goncalves' family launched a scholarship fund in her name. It's aimed at supporting young women entering law enforcement. Ethan Chapin's parents created a memorial garden at the University of Idaho. A space for quiet, for healing. And in a small way, these actions are louder than Kohberger's silence. Because when he declined to speak, he gave up something vital: narrative power. Now, the families control the story. Not him. And that's where we leave you. With a case that's legally over, but emotionally unresolved. A man is behind bars. But the scars remain. The questions remain. And maybe, so does the danger. So we ask you. Would you want to hear him speak? Would you sit in a courtroom, knowing that he might lie, just for the chance to understand? If someone took your family member, would you want their why? Or would you rather they rot in silence? Do we study killers to protect the future? Or does that only make them more famous? And finally, what does justice really look like to you? Is it a sentence? Or is it silence? If this case moved you, if the silence, the strength of the families, and the open wounds left questions in your mind, speak up. Comment below with your honest thoughts. Let's start a conversation that courts won't allow. And if you want more in-depth storytelling, rooted in truth, not hype, subscribe to Behind Closed Doors. We go deeper. We stay respectful. And we never forget. This story is closed. But the questions? They're just beginning.